Thank you for joining ILTV's live broadcast with Startup Nation Central. Looking back at 2021, it's been a whirlwind year. Israel has just come out of the fourth wave of the coronavirus pandemic, many countries in the world still in the midst. But despite the lockdowns and hardships, Israel's tech ecosystem once again proving its resilience. And not only that, emerging stronger than ever before. Startup Nation Central, a nonprofit organization that connects businesses, governments, and NGOs from around the world to Israeli innovation, just released its annual report, which found that Israeli tech had a record year in 2021. And so joining me now in the studio with all the details about the report and more from Startup Nation Central are Meir Valman, Director of Research, Emma Vardimon, Director of Strategic Partnerships, and Michal Seror, Director of Ecosystem Development. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Meir, let's start with you. The end of the year report, looking back at 2021, it's found really a record-breaking year, some $24 billion in investments, countless other achievements. How do you explain this?
So it's been a very strong period for technology generally, all over the world, thanks to increased digitization, whether it's among businesses, whether it's amongst consumers who didn't use it so much in the past. And everyone's benefited from this, but Israeli startups have benefited particularly. And I think the factors that explain that are, first of all, Israel's always been far from its target markets. So startups have had to get used to the fact that they operate remotely. A lot of their business is done over the telephone. They think globally from day one. So that's also been an important factor, that they're not just focusing on the local markets, but they're able to benefit from increased demand all over the globe. And thirdly, they're very quick to respond. That's always been a characteristic of Israeli startups. And the pandemic came, there was a need for response, and they responded very quickly. And they were able to gain an advantage over their competitors elsewhere in the world.
Quick to respond. Michal, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think with Israeli startups, they've always been very agile. You know, on top of everything that Meir said, that ability to respond quickly and change and adapt. And I think the COVID period this is what was required. Everybody needed to change phase and do it quickly. And that ability to pivot has been a real game changer for Israeli startups.
And Emma, same question to you.
So we can agree that innovation is a driver for growth and prosperity, and COVID has accelerated it very fastly. In 2020, most of the global corporate and large multinationals were reassessing the way they will work, what are their needs. And in 2021, we saw them coming back to us with very defined needs in very various sectors.
All right, so we have lots to discuss, but before we begin, let's take a quick look at some of the highlights from this past year. All right, and now let's take a look at some of the specifics from the report. Meir, I understand that there were three main sectors that dominated investments. There was fintech, security technologies, and enterprise IT and data infrastructure. So what can you tell us about Israel's successes in these fields?
So those three sectors have been the dominant sectors in Israel for some time now, even before the pandemic. And they share a number of characteristics in common. Firstly, they're pure software sectors. But in addition to that, it's very easy for them to scale up a product quickly, as well as cheaply. And it's also very easy to distribute that product. And all those things were particular advantages during the time of COVID. It allowed them to pivot if they needed to change their product. And more importantly, it allowed them to distribute their product very quickly. So as demand increased very, very rapidly, it's very, very easy to distribute a software product. So that helped them a lot. And the other factor I think that's really important is that these have been the most profitable sectors for investors over a number of years. And as sales increased the strongest in those sectors during 2021, investors decided this was an even more attractive place to put their money. And as a result, their allocation in terms of investment has increased even more.
Now, I'm curious as well about other startup fields. I mean, Emma, how did they fare this past year?
So at Startup Nation Central, my team is managing the relationship with global corporate, multinational that are looking to connect to Israeli innovation. We curate around 80 business-oriented, customized delegation a year. On our front, we saw a lot of demand that came from various other sectors. Digital health, the need for remote monitoring, diagnostics, telemedicine, for the big industrial companies that have manufacturing activities. It was about prediction, maintenance, of course, of the logistic and the supply chain also was a very hot topic. As well, agriculture has become very major, all the need for food security. So in agriculture, we saw need also in smart sensors, the use of drones, smart sensors for yield optimization, water management, even autonomous tractors due to the shortage of the workforce for all the lockdowns. And in food also, alternative proteins attract a lot of attention.
Okay, and Michal, I mean, are there any fields that we should be keeping our eye on for the future?
Well, I think there's, and that's part of what we do as an organization as well, is kind of trying to understand where the next opportunity lays. So we have the areas which we know that Israel is strong in, and that we probably will continue to lead on the way, but there's also areas which the world is looking for solutions, and probably if Israeli startups will know how to look at it, then we'll be able to provide solutions there. And I think in the whole area that is very much spoken about at the moment, the whole area of climate, impact, sustainability, we have some great technological solutions, but Israeli startups haven't yet looked at that field. And as a nonprofit that's trying to really help the ecosystem to gauge where they should put their focus on, and so I think these are areas that are definitely areas for growth that are yet to be discovered. And there's also new markets that we haven't completely taken over and kind of completely understood how to access them as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the report for a second, I mean, it also stated that Israel saw a record number of mega rounds, right? We had 33 companies join Israel's Unicorn Club, which for those who may not know are privately held companies valued at over $1 billion. So how is it that we are seeing such large rounds of investments? I mean, when did this trend start? And is this the norm going forward?
So there's been a huge increase in fundraising in the VC space over the last 2 years. Mm. And this fundraising hasn't been distributed evenly. So most of the money has gone to the very largest global investors. And a lot of those global investors already have a presence in Israel or have invested in Israel. But what we've seen over the last year or so is that they've increased the amount of investment they do in Israel. So they're investing more times and they're investing larger sums. And the result of that is we get to more of these mega rounds and we end up with more unicorns as well. And what's interesting is that a lot of the unicorns are not necessarily companies we would have expected to be unicorns, say 2 years ago. But because of the changes over the last 2 years, those are the companies that have really seen the most demand over this period. So for example, in enterprise software, we have a company called Monday.com, which did an IPO this year. And really demand for their products just went through the roof because of remote working and because of the need to organize companies' workflow online. In cyber, we've had SentinelOne, who we mentioned earlier in the video. They work in the area of endpoint security, and this is the need to secure people's computers, people who are working from home, people who are not in the central office. And so that's been another example of a company that benefited from the changes. And the way things are going, it doesn't look like this is going to change. Fundraising this year was actually even stronger. And so it looks like mega rounds are here to stay. And there's also a huge pipeline of Israeli startups who've reached later stages, ready to raise these kinds of rounds. And so we expect this to continue.
So it's a trend that we'll see in the coming years. And now there was also a record year for IPOs and acquisitions. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this was the strongest year ever in terms of that. These things tend to go in waves. And this year there was a particularly strong risk appetite in the market for IPOs. This was also helped by the emergence of SPACs, which is a new phenomenon. But it did allow a lot of companies to go public who previously wouldn't have been able to go public at that kind of stage. It's hard to know exactly how long this will continue. But as long as it does continue and more capital is returned to investors as a result of these exits, more capital will then flow back into funds, and that will help to increase, or to at least to maintain the volume of investment that we've seen this year.
I can say also that from kind of looking at the field and kind of speaking to the startups, if a few years back, many of them would be all about, okay, let's do the exit. A lot of them are now thinking about, okay, let's grow the company. Let's actually create something here, something that's more substantial and long-term, and kind of that more strategic long-term thinking, which for Israeli startups is in a way a little bit new. They weren't very much into that. They were into, okay, let's get out of this and find our next challenge. And that building, that constructing something is really nice to see.
Now, in the report, it also noted that the foreign funds dominated investments in Israeli startups. So how important is the role of foreign corporate investments? Emma?
So on my side, we work with the large corporates. What is interesting to see that about 15% of the investment were done by the investment arm of those large corporates, called corporate VCs, CVCs. And as Meir mentioned earlier, Israeli startups are looking from day one to go global. And these investors are strategic investors. They are called smart money because they offer not only to invest money and look for a good return on their investment, but as well a channel of distribution abroad, either if by implementing the solution in their company or as an offering and service for their clients outside.
All right, now I want to move on to talk a little bit about international collaborations. It's been a little over a year since the signing of the Abraham Accords, and this past year has already shown many promising collaborations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates across many different fields. And so before we discuss, let's take a quick look.
The Israel Business Council recently noted that it's expected bilateral trade to exceed $3 billion of trade in 3 years, and more than 1,000 Israeli companies to be active in the UAE by September 2022.
At every level I look at, whether it's tourism, whether it's innovation, whether it's SME, we're very much aligned. I'm very positive about the future, and I want you all to visit us in the UAE, and I'm sure we can take this relationship much further, specifically on entrepreneurship and tourism as well.
If we look at all the aspects of our economy, we can see potential for collaboration, for mutual benefit, for mutual support, bringing added value to each other.
All right, Michal, let's start with you. So what fruits has this relationship borne so far?
Well, in terms of kind of the general numbers, they're mentioning $500 million in trade, in bilateral trade already for 2021, which is great numbers for a year, I think. We all would agree on that. For the tech ecosystem, it's also been interesting. We've already seen an investment from an Emirati fund in an Israeli growth startup, which is called Aleph Farms. And they led a round of $105 million, which is huge for a food tech company. And also some investments from funds in Israel in UAE-based startups as well. So we're starting to see something grow and kind of this mutual interest growing there. And we've also signed MOUs. We hosted, as you saw in the video, 70 VIP top Emirati leaders, both from government and from private companies here in Israel. So in a way, this year has been it's kind of been that dating phase in this whole agreement. So kind of getting to know each other, understanding what is on each side, and many Israelis flying over and kind of getting to understand this market. And I think it's an interesting market because what we're seeing is that it's possibly an entry point to so many more other markets for Israeli startups, which is completely new for us. So definitely discovery, and on Emma's front, she's hosted quite a few different government officials as well.
Yes, we had the visit of the Ministry of Food Security in our building. Today she's also leading the climate change subject. We had also the visit of the President of Colombia coming and looking at Israel, wanting to replicate the Israeli ecosystem and to look at much more connection and collaboration. They're opening an innovation authority agency in Jerusalem today. So they're coming to us to see how is the best way to look for a technological solution and the best way to connect and find interesting model of operation with the Israeli ecosystem.
Now you mentioned we're in the dating phase with the United Arab Emirates. What can we expect looking forward for, let's say, the next year or a couple of years?
So I think like in any relationship, it's kind of really deepening these relationships, creating more substantial ties between the two countries. Also, maybe understanding what each one brings to the table. So the UAE is very good at strategic thinking, forward thinking, building, structuring, bringing the government into this structure of working with the tech ecosystem, while we're a lot more agile, quick, you know, everything's really short term and really quick to pivot. So I think those two edges of the scale, kind of bring them together, can be a really interesting combination. And obviously kind of potentially also opening the gates to other markets which Israel at the moment doesn't have access to. And just the UAE doing this, driving this change, can help formalize a lot of things that are happening under the radar at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, Emma, you see dozens of delegations. What other international partnerships are forming, and what can we expect to see from those in the coming years? So,
mainly, we can say that technology has become really the answer today. And I'm really joining Michal's point that she said earlier, that climate, we see a lot of our climate coming and turning to us to find solutions for climate and sustainability, really on all sector, across sector. So I think that it's going to be really the next hype here that we're going to talk about next time that you host us.
Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about sort of the benefits and all the positives in terms of the tech ecosystem, but let's talk a little bit about the challenges. I mean, are there any challenges that the sector has faced this past year?
Definitely. There's no good without the bad, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's one challenge that every startup that I speak to and every person will mention, and that's the human capital challenge. Mm-hmm. If a year or two back we would talk about mainly the software engineers, the data analysts, those people that are doing all the programming aspects, and we knew that there's a shortage and we have to help fill that gap. Today, we're talking about an overall shortage of human capital for all startups. It's from the marketing positions. You know, some of the entrepreneurs are telling me, well, I can't even find a good administrative person to run the company. And So all these roles within the startups are very much lacking. So I guess if you have people watching this and they're excellent English speakers and want to join the high-tech force, this is the time. So that is definitely one big challenge for all of the startups. And I think also that all these great rounds and investments doesn't spread out evenly. So while we're seeing it really strong in some sectors, there are other sectors that are still kind of still struggling to find investors, to have funding. Just a couple of weeks back, we took some startups from the assistive tech sector, so helping people with disabilities, for example. And we took these startups to the UAE market, and they were telling us that, listen, it might be great for everybody else, but we still need help with promoting this whole sector. So, but Meir knows more about like in the aspects of the numbers, but that's kind of from the ground where we're getting that feedback.
So Meir, I mean, what can you tell us? We talked about the big three sectors. What about on the other end of the spectrum? What sectors are sort of have found it to be a challenging year?
So this is exactly what Emma was talking about earlier. So many of the sectors that we deal with, things such as agtech, for example, it's a huge sector, but it definitely struggles to attract enough investment. And that's one of the reasons why we're so involved in that sector, in order to help it, but also because of its strategic value. And I think also in climate tech, as Michal was talking about earlier as well, this is a sector which was, some of the elements of it, such as energy, clean energy, were very strong about 20 years ago. That wave kind of ended, wasn't so successful in many ways. Now it's become something that's of great interest again, but we're yet to see investment come back into the same degree. And I'm hoping that's something that's going to change over the next year.
Now, I have to ask, because there are many critics, and we hear this all the time, that the Israeli high tech is just a bubble, and eventually this bubble is going to burst. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
So bubbles tend to occur when valuations get completely out of whack with the actual fundamentals of companies and their prospects. And certainly it's true, valuations have increased this year across the spectrum. On the other hand, so have sales, and so have future prospects. So it's very, very difficult to really tell, looking forward, is this a bubble or not, or are these valuations justified? And I think we'll only know that really in retrospect. What I think we can say is, because the pace of increase of investment in Israel this year has been faster than the rest of the world, that the valuation gap that did exist before between Israeli startups and startups elsewhere has certainly narrowed, if not closed completely. So that's really a big change that's occurred this year.
And Emma, what challenges do you see?
I think that we can say that instability and uncertainty is a constant in our life. Flexibility is a key component for doing business today. So the only silver lining that I see is that it's global and not only local. So everybody is much more agile, open, and willing to find other ways of communication, of collaboration, to set the POC online, or to be more patient one with another. So I think great collaboration continuing, and as long as there are real needs out there, so I think that the companies will continue to grow, and technology will continue to bring us value.
Now, you mentioned human capital. It's a major challenge. I mean, how is Israel addressing this challenge?
Well, there's quite a few organizations out there that are trying to solve this challenge. 3 years ago, we established a sister organization, which is called Scale Up Velocity, to address the human capital challenge. And they've developed quite a few programs that look at minority groups and incorporating them into the high-tech sector, closing the gap between the education and the requirements of the industry. So in a way, there's a lot of different organizations trying to deal with this human capital challenge, and it will become even more a challenge, I think, next year as well. So let's talk about that next time that we come along.
The next time we'll have an even larger crisis in terms of human capital, you're saying?
Probably so.
Okay. And I mean, will this have any effect on the numbers, Meir? Will this have any effect on the company's successes if they can't hire the right people?
Well, the biggest effect that's happening so far is simply that companies are hiring abroad. And that's become much easier with remote working. So they have really a global market of people to choose from. The issue for us more is that we would like people to be hired in Israel. And so I don't think it's going to affect companies so much. I think it's going to affect more where the hiring takes place.
Okay. So we are almost out of time, but I would like to hear your final thoughts looking forward, looking to the future. I mean, where is the Israeli tech ecosystem headed in 2022? Next year, we'll be here talking about the annual report. Are we going to see another record-breaking year? Meir, let's start with you.
So if we look on the investment side, this year has been another record year for fundraising by investors. So if we take that as our indicator, that would suggest that next year will be as strong, if not stronger, in terms of investment for Israel. However, there's a lot of things that could change that picture. We're facing a year when interest rates are likely to rise, which is generally a negative for investment in the tech sector. We're facing the prospect of economic slowdown if that happens as well. And there's also the risk of the pandemic again. It hasn't gone away. There could be another variant. There could be some kind of disruption because of that. So, these are all things that could get in the way. And the stock market as well. The stock market has been very strong this year. If the stock market takes a dive, that will also affect the desire of investors to invest so much. So these are all things that could change that picture.
And Michal, what are your final thoughts?
Oh, I'm not very good with the crystal ball thing. I tend not to try and think what will happen forward. I do know that that we shouldn't take these things for granted. Success is something that we should. We need to continue working hard to stay as one of the most innovative countries. We're always in one of the top 10 most innovative countries, and it requires work. It requires working together. It requires bringing in government, assessing, looking at things, understanding what are the challenges that stop us from continuing the success. So I don't know what will happen next year, but for sure we'll need to work with it, all of us together.
And Emma, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that multinational corporate will continue to strengthen their technological assets and technological solution. And in order to move fast and to give answer to all the needs out there, they will more and more have to collaborate with what is called open innovation, collaborate with startups that can bring in very fastly those solutions instead of trying to solve them from within in-house and develop their own solution. So more and more collaboration with what we call open innovation, more and more startups, and we hope to see them in various sectors as well.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have for today's panel. Thank you to our guests, Meir Valman, Emma Vardimon, and Michal Seror from Startup Nation Central for sharing your valuable insights with us today. And if any of you missed out on some of the show and want to view it again, you can on ILTV's new platform, ILTV+. Thanks for joining us.